On the north side of the Savannah River across from Augusta, Georgia, sits this semi-private, self-described golfer's paradise. It promises a unique setting which includes ultra-dwarf Bermuda greens, numerous lakes, wetlands, and dramatic bunkers. What it does not include is any trace of what used to be here. In 1876, this was the village of Hamburg, South Carolina. Its population was mostly black, with black officials and property owners, a hopeful display of the nation's new birth of freedom. 1876 was a centenary year. Festivities for the 100th anniversary of American independence were a big deal around the nation. On the 4th of July, 1876 in Hamburg, black residents, including many freedmen, heard the words of the Declaration of Independence read aloud in the town center. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In 1876, those words rang with new promise, and it seemed for a moment as though the scope of those ideals might include black men. At the time, the Republican Party represented an interracial coalition formally committed to equal rights, and a dramatic break with the past. Black men voted and held office as Republicans, and some white men, scalawags and carpetbaggers to their hostile opponents, allied with them politically to try to build a new society after the Civil War. Led by former Confederate officers, white Democrats were determined to stop them. On July 4th, a black militia company was parading on Hamburg's main street in celebration of the centennial. Two white men, returning to their Aiken County home from Augusta, provoked an altercation with the militia. 4 days later, mobilized by Edgefield planter and former Confederate General Matthew Butler, heavily armed white men from both sides of the river converged on Hamburg. They demanded that the militia surrender their guns and apologize to the two white men. Barricaded inside a building, militia captain and Union Army veteran Doc Adams sent a terse, forceful reply. No. The white mob, which included a planter from Edgefield named Benjamin Tillman, opened an assault. The heavily outnumbered and outgunned militia made a valiant but doomed stand. When whites hauled a cannon from Augusta and began bombarding the building, the militia's position became impossible, and they dispersed in various directions. The white mob gunned down 2 men. Doc Adams was able to successfully escape, and others, surrounded, had no choice but to surrender. Members of the mob took 4 of the prisoners, marched them off one by one to a distance, and executed them. By 4 the next morning, their bloodlust satiated, the mob released the remaining prisoners and dispersed. They had killed 6 black men: Hamburg Sheriff Jim Cook, Moses Parks, Militia Lieutenant Charles Attaway, Dave Phillips, Hamp Stevens, and Alfred Minyard. In the early crossfire, the militia had killed 1 member of the mob, Thomas Mackay Merriweather. The violence quickly became known nationally as the Hamburg Massacre, a chilling example of cold-blooded white terrorism. Newspapers around the country condemned the actions of the white mob. The New York Times wrote that it makes one blush for shame that the wretches who did the work should call themselves American citizens. Harper's Weekly ran at least 2 cartoons related to the massacre. A congressional debate held in July 1876, and a subsequent Senate investigation into the denial of the elective franchise in South Carolina, ultimately yielded nothing. Born enslaved, Hamburg trial justice Prince Rivers issued arrest warrants for 87 white men, including Matthew Butler and Ben Tillman. But for Butler and fellow Edgefield planter Martin Gary, the massacre was an inspiration for political mobilization. White vigilante violence had overthrown Republican governments in other Southern states. Now, with an election only months away, Gary and Butler reasoned that through targeted and threatened violence, white Democrats could regain control of South Carolina. Gary began organizing statewide paramilitary clubs, the Red Shirts, and Butler nominated former Confederate general and prominent planter Wade Hampton for governor. It was no ordinary election season. Hampton's campaign employed extravagant displays intended to dramatize the contest. In one account, South Carolina was represented by a bowed figure draped in robes of dense black and wrapped with chains. When Hampton approached the speaker's stand, the chains and mourning robes were cast aside, and a young woman in pure white stood tall and stately, head uplifted and eyes shining like stars. Red Shirts were rioting too, making displays of force, attacking black citizens, threatening violence at polling stations. On Election Day in Edgefield, from this porch at his home, Gary gave an impassioned speech to hundreds of Red Shirts, who then processed to the courthouse to prevent blacks from voting. And inside, Butler and Gary's men were stuffing the ballots. Normally Republican Edgefield returned a mathematically impossible Democratic majority, securing Hampton's victory. It was unclear who really won the governor's election. Republicans and Democrats both claimed victory. And South Carolina's questionable election returns cast doubt on the winner of the presidential election. Ultimately, through the Compromise of 1877, Democrats conceded the White House to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. In return, Hayes ordered federal troops away from protecting the South Carolina State House. Hampton and the Democrats promptly occupied it and elevated Matthew Butler to the United States Senate. Reconstruction had come to an end in South Carolina and the nation. It was the abrupt close of a promising new epoch of equal rights and interracial politics, and the beginning of a new era of triumphant white supremacy. And Benjamin Pitchfork Tillman would be elected governor and U.S. Senator. In the early 20th century, he would regale white audiences with stories of the Red Shirts, with what he called the gospel of white supremacy. No one would ever go to trial for their role in the Hamburg massacre. With the forced decline of black politics, Prince Rivers, a Union Army veteran and former state legislator, lived his last decade as a carriage driver for whites. Ultimately, a flood took what was left of Hamburg. A regime of silence and forgetfulness took what was left of its memory. But on major thoroughfares in Augusta and North Augusta, a different sort of way of remembering dominates the view. On Broad Street in Augusta, a 76-foot-high monument celebrates the Confederacy in unambiguous terms. It was unveiled in 1878, 2 years after the massacre, and a year after federal troops withdrew from South Carolina. In attendance at the event were at least 4 detachments of the so-called Red Shirt Democracy. The area is not entirely bereft of monuments to the Hamburg massacre, however. In North Augusta, a tall obelisk on the grounds of a prominent antebellum-style inn honors Thomas Merriweather as the young hero of the Hamburg riot. The monument is not really about Merriweather, but about the cause he represented. Just down the street, a Veterans Memorial Park is named in honor of Wade Hampton. It features a granite marker for each of America's wars. The marker for the War of 1812 displays little confidence in what that war was actually about. There is no such ambiguity about the meaning of the Civil War. let their virtues plead for just judgment of the cause in which they perished. This apparent forthrightness in what the Civil War is supposed to have meant may have something to do with the fact that the chairman of the Wade Hampton Veterans Park was also a life member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The park was constructed in 1993. In Edgefield, the bodies of Matthew Butler and Martin Gary rest in a local cemetery, alongside the town's many political figures who helped entrench the white supremacist establishment, like Preston Brooks and Strom Thurmond, whose statue dominates the town square. The former home of Martin Gary now contains a museum and shrine to the Red Shirts. Today, on either side of the Savannah River, there is little evidence of the black victims of the Hamburg massacre. A devastating flood in 1929 forced remaining residents to relocate up the bluff. A small marker on a little-traveled dead-end road there commemorates the massacre and its victims.